Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friends today. One of our goals with Bible Study with Friends is to show and grow a passion for studying God's Word. We want to show that the way we do it, and we hopefully will grow it in ourselves and in our friends, but also in you, the viewing audience. And we thank you on YouTube for joining us and on podcasts for listening in. We hope that you're blessed, and we hope you take a moment, hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell button if you want to receive an email every week when we post this, and you'll get a reminder. And thanks for coming in. We are here with my friend from the upper side, my upper left, Philip Thomas. And Philip, welcome.
Thank you.
Philip is in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Woohoo.
And Natalie and Allie down below are our friends. And they are, what city are you in?
Lehigh, Utah.
Lehigh?
Lehigh.
Lehigh.
Yeah.
I was thinking the soda pop when I was thinking, but anyway, Lehigh. And I'm up in Salt Lake. So this is the miracle of technology, and we're all joined together. We're all to do a Bible study. We are in the book of Jonah. We have started Jonah, and we're watching for Jonah and what Jonah teaches us beyond just the Sunday school lesson that we're all familiar with, or even people that have never been in church kind of feel familiar with the idea of Jonah and the whale, and know the basics of the story. We're going to go beyond the basics. We're going to perhaps dig a little deeper. We left off last week in chapter 1, verse 17, with this is where Jonah is thrown overboard in the storm and is swallowed by the great fish, the great mammal, the great whale. We don't know what it is, but it's a Leviathan is what the Hebrew talks about, but it's a great beast, a water beast, and it swallows him. Now that's the story that we get from Sunday school. I want us to think a little bit, and I want us to talk a little bit about this before we get into verse 1 of chapter 2. We know that in chapter 1, we look over at chapter 1, in verse 2, God gives a command to his prophet Jonah. Now, Jonah is a functioning prophet. He's been a prophet in other places in the New Testament. He's mentioned in the book of Kings, and he's a functioning prophet. Now, what is God's command to Jonah? This is review. You weren't with us, Philip, but this is catching you up, and it's review for Natalie and Allie. So what was the command?
To arise and go to Nineveh.
Go to Nineveh. All right. Now, arise and go. We talked about that. That's a command that we as Christians are given all the time. The Great Commission, go. Okay. Now what was Jonah's immediate reaction? And I know you know this too, Philip, but what was the immediate thing Jonah did when God says, arise and go to Nineveh?
Did the opposite?
He went in exactly the opposite direction, didn't he? He said, there is no way, and there's no turmoil in his, oh, should I go? Shouldn't I go? No, he just immediately says, I'm not going there. Now, there were two reasons for that we talked about, and that is, one is a political reason. Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, and Assyria was attacking Israel. So they were political enemies and military enemies. But the other thing is the Ninevites. How do you like that for a great word, Ninevites? Anyway, the Ninevites were Gentiles. They were not Jewish. They were not Hebrew. They were not at all. And Israel has a hang up with this idea of dealing with Gentiles. And if God was going to pronounce judgment on Nineveh and say, hey, Jonah, I want you to write about my judgment of Nineveh, he would have been happy to do that. There are other prophets that God says, write about my judgment on them. Babylon, there Egypt. There are a number of times when God says to a prophet, you write down what I'm going to do to them, right? And he would have been happy to do that. But this command was different. How? How was the command different than just write about my judgment of Nineveh?
He had to go to this Gentile nation and tell them face to face.
The command was for him to actually go there, to actually go into the enemy territory and Gentile territory and deliver this message. And he says, I'm not going. And he immediately disobeys. That leads to depression. We covered that in chapter 1, where he's sleeping. He knows he's separated from God. He knows he's being disobedient, and he's running from the presence of God. And it talks about that. So in chapter 2, there's a great storm that God sends, and the storm obeys him, and the winds obey him, and the great fish obeys him, but Jonah the prophet doesn't obey him. I think that's really funny. And sometimes we as Christians need to be careful, because sometimes we take God's forgiveness so much for granted that we slip into disobedience, where other people, even non-believers, might be a lot more concerned about going against God. And we get so comfortable with him that he said, I'm not going, I'm not doing it. So we know the story up to this point. He's in the water, he's been thrown there, and he's been eaten by a fish. And this is the payoff for his disobedience, right?
Yeah.
Now, has God ever, this is another question for us to kind of think about. This is pretty extreme for God to deal with a disobedient believer. Don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, he creates a storm, and it's the mother of all storms, right? Professional sailors are scared to death and are worried. And he creates this huge storm, and he batters this little ship until finally the sailors figure out that it's Jonah and throw him overboard. And immediately the storm stops. And the Gentile sailors start to believe in God, because the storm just automatically stops. This shows God's power. So Jonah is in the water. Now, I was thinking about, has there ever been a time when God seems to go to extremes to get me to obey him? Where I know kind of what I ought to do and decide I just don't want to do it, and stuff starts to happen. Does anything like that ever happen to you guys? Where it just seems God really goes out of his way to correct you? No? You guys are just so holy and obedient?
I think it's definitely happened.
Yeah, and while it's happening, you kind of know why. You kind of go, yeah, I knew what I was getting into when I disobeyed God, and now I'm getting a spanking, right?
Yeah.
So Jonah, who is a prophet and knows God, we're gonna pick up in chapter 2, verse 1, and we're gonna quickly go through that. I think we can get through this whole chapter. I'm gonna go to my screen sharing. I want to make sure you guys can see this. Can you see this, Philip and all? There we are. Okay. Now, he's in the water and the fish swallows him. And we get right away, Jonah prays to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish. Now, there's a spiritual lesson there for us. If we're doing what we just were talking about I'm flagrantly being disobedient to God. I know I am, and I know he's putting me through some interesting times to correct me, right? Now, what can we see in verse 1 that's a great lesson for us to embrace?
To pray first.
Okay, number 1 is no matter where we are, we can pray. So God is always ready to hear us when he starts to put us through some hard times to correct us. He's always willing to hear us, right? So this, I want to especially think about from the belly of the fish. What does that tell us about prayer and the lesson we can learn? Have you ever been in such a situation? This happened to me where it looked so bad that I thought I don't even know if I could pray from here because it's just such a disaster. And I think it's significant that he can pray to his God, number 1. So even though he's being disobedient, he knows he has a relationship with God. He's not just praying to God, he's praying to his God. There's a relationship there. And he's praying from the belly of the fish. And I wrote in my notes that even here, let's look at it, say that even here we can pray. Even in the worst, it looks like the worst situation possible, we can still pray. And he prays. Now, that we go into his prayer, and I want to read his prayer to you. Verse 2 and 3 is his prayer. And here's his prayer. He prayed, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Now, what's the first thing you notice about this? That he prays, saying. What's the first thing you notice about that in verse 2? Right here. I called out to the Lord out of my distress.
What's the first thing we notice? That he's in distress.
Okay. Is he praying to God?
Is this a trick question? Yes.
Yeah, it's a trick question. Now, look, he says, he prayed, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Now, is he talking to God?
Yes.
No, he's not. No, look at it. If he was talking to God, if this was a prayer to God, he would say, I called out to you in my distress, and you answered me. Now, this is significant because what he's basically doing is telling us, a listening audience, he's telling us what he prayed. But this is not him, quote, praying. This is telling us what he prayed. Okay? Now, I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol, I cried, and you heard my voice. So all of a sudden he switches. Now he's praying to God. He starts out talking about God, and then he says, out of the belly of Sheol, I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. Now, does that prayer seem kind of stiff to you?
What do you mean by stiff?
Does that sound like a panic prayer to you? Number one, he starts out telling us what he prayed, but then even when he's praying to God, and he says, out of the belly of Sheol, which is death, out of the belly of the shadow of death, right? I cried, and you heard my voice, because you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me, all your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. Does that sound like a prayer of panic in the middle of drowning?
No, because he sounds like he's reassured, like he's going to get out of there.
Okay? What do you think? What do you think, Philip? Does that sound like a panic prayer?
It kind of does to me. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say I cried for help if like I wasn't in like duress to do so. Like, so for me, it kind of does sound like.
Now, how would you compare this prayer? He is drowning. How would you compare this prayer with Peter's prayer when he gets out and he's walking in the water towards Jesus and he looks around and he starts to panic and he starts to sink? What was his prayer like? You remember?
Save me.
Save me. 2 words
That's true.
with an exclamation point. You know, it was, save me. Now, what I want to get here is Jonah prays a very formal style of prayer here. He prays in the style of Psalms, which is the prayer book of Israel. Okay? But this is a very formal prayer. This would almost be like, okay, I know I've sinned. I know I disobeyed God, and God is putting me through some trials. So I'm going to pray, oh Lord God, I have sinned against you. Please forgive my sin based upon the propitiation of your Son upon the cross who died for my sin. You see what I'm saying? It's a very formal style of prayer. Jonah is not panicking at this point. He is praying, and he's praying basically based upon the aspect that it's his God. He knows he has a relationship with God, and he's praying this very formal prayer, and he admits something in the prayer. In verse 4, he said, then I said, I'm going to go back to that verse there. In verse 4, he says, then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Now, that is exactly where he wanted to be. Remember when what he told the sailors in chapter 1? What did he tell the sailors in chapter 1? I am doing what? Do you remember?
He's fleeing from the presence of the Lord.
I'm fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And he says, I was running from your presence, and you have put me in circumstances that I'm no longer doing the running, you are doing the driving. You are driving me away from your presence, from your sight. So I get that I'm being punished here. And God's reaction to the disobedience is, you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea. The flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. And then we get the only statement of real faith that he has in this. Do you see that in verse 4? with that word right there?
Yet?
Yet. He says, you have driven me away from your sight, yet, even though I'm in sin and even though I'm being driven away, I know, I have the assurance that I will again look upon your holy temple. Now, we as Christians have eternal security. We have an assurance that if we go off the rails and we sin, it isn't that we lose our salvation and are going to hell, but God will spank us and discipline us to get us back into fellowship with him and back on track. So even in the midst of my confession, I could say, I'm sorry for this, but I thank you that you died for those sins and that I'm still going to heaven. And if I died without confession, I'm going to stand before, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where the guys who built his life on the foundation of Christ, he was a Christian, but everything he did was wood, hay, and stubble, and it was burned up in the fire, and he says, but you were still saved by fire. So you stand before God and go, well, all I got to offer you is these ashes because I didn't do anything in my life to be obedient. And that's kind of what Jonah is praying here. Are you with me? It makes sense?
Yeah.
So he's being at this point in the experience in the sea, he's being very religious. He's being very formal in his prayer. Okay? Now he knows that prayer is based upon, he's praying to his God, and he knows, even though I'm drowning, I'm going to see your temple. I'm going to heaven because I'm a believer. So there's some assurance there. And then we go back. This is where it really gets interesting. Now, a number of scholars believe that between verse 4 and verse 5, Jonah actually dies. And that he is brought back from death. He is resurrected from the dead. He uses some terminology here. He says, the water closed over me to take my life. Okay? It closed over me to kill me. The deep surrounded me. The weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. In other words, he's in the water and he hits the bottom and he's being scraped along and the seaweeds are wrapping around him and he's feeling the bottom of the ocean. I mean, he's drowned. He is down there deep, right? And he says, I went down to the land. So he's feeling, he's hitting bottom. And he goes, whose bars closed upon me forever. And he's basically saying, I was so deep that I died. Now, if he doesn't die, he comes very close to it, right? But a lot of scholars believe that he dies, and they do it based upon something that Jesus said here. I'm going to go back. Hold on a second. Based upon what Jesus said in, I want to turn to this. Turn over to let me find the verse. Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. I want you to read verse 40 and 41. Philip, why don't you read that? You're reading from the New American Standard, right, Philip?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll follow along with the ESV, but read Matthew 12, 40 and 41. Now, this is where the Pharisees and Sadducees were not believing who Jesus was and everything. And they finally kind of, in a snarky way, they kind of said, well, hey, show us a sign. Now, he'd been doing miracles like crazy. But now they say, well, show us a sign. And this is Jesus' reply. Now, read what Jesus said in 40 and 41.
For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here.
Okay, now, basically what Jesus said, and the first thing that they say, he died, is that little phrase, when Jesus is speaking in the Greek, it says, just as Jonah went in for 3 days, I'm going to be 3 days in the earth. Well, he doesn't go into the gravesite and rest. He dies in the grave. I mean, he dies before he goes in the grave. So he's dead in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. So when Jesus says, just as Jonah did, I'm going to do, that's why scholars say, oh, okay, Jesus is saying that Jonah actually dies and God brings him back to fulfill the mission. And then Jesus says something very interesting that goes to my point about where we're going to go in chapter 3. He says, the men of Nineveh who repented are going to condemn this generation. And he's talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? Because they repented and you guys won't react to the sign. Right?
Yeah.
Now, to say to the Jews, this is Jesus speaking to the Jewish religious elite, that the men of Nineveh, now what religion are the men of Nineveh? What nationality are they?
They're Assyrians.
Yeah, they're Gentiles. They're Assyrians. They are not Jews. And Jesus says that these non-Jews are going to judge Israel because they repented when they saw the sign of resurrection. Wow. And Israel's not going to. That says a lot. That's a wow, because Jesus is saying, hey, the Gentiles know better.
Wow.
And they reacted with belief. You guys won't. So Jesus brings in a racial component. And we're going to see that as we go here. Now let's go back again to our verses. And that's why, by the way, that scholars think that he dies here, because this is like what Jesus said, just as I went 3 days, 3 nights in the earth, Jonah went 3 days, 3 nights in the fish. He's going to die and be buried in the earth. Jonah is going to die and we think be resurrected. And then he says this, I went down to the land, in verse 6, went down, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit. Now that's a Jewish colloquialism. The pit was the pit of death. And then he goes, O Lord my God. Now this is, again, very formal. This is, O Father, Lord God Almighty. This is not a panic prayer. This is that it is yet a prayer of faith. The two things that Jonah says that really shows, I think, a genuine faith is in verse 4 when he says, you are punishing me, but I'm still going to see heaven. And I was dead, yet you brought my life up, O Lord, my God. That relationship, right? Are you with me?
Yeah.
Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Nod. See, people on podcasts can't see you nod. You have to say, yes, Len, I see you. Yes. Okay. Anyway, never mind. Now I want to go to the next. I want to go up here to this. We're looking right at 30 minutes. I want to finish this real quick. It says, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. And you can see in my notes here, Psalm 143:5, and that is where I was in sin and I remembered the Lord. And my prayer came to you into your holy temple. In other words, I prayed and you heard my prayer from heaven. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. In other words, if I wasn't a believer, if I was an idol worshiper, I could not have this confidence in my prayer. But I know that you do not forsake because of your steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Now, there is a concept here called the sacrifice of praise. The sacrifice of praise, and there's, if you're watching on YouTube, you can stop the tape right here, or the viewing right here, and look at these verses over here. I'm going to bring them up closer. These verses in Psalm 107:22, in Psalm 116:16 through 19, in Hosea 14:2, Philippians chapter 4 verse 6, Hebrews chapter 13:15, and Psalm 50:23, all talk about offering God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Now, when he says, I with a voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you, what is that? You know, let's talk about that for a second, just for a minute or two. What does, in your mind, what does giving God a sacrifice of thanksgiving look like? Well, all right, let's break it down. If we're meditating about this, if I read that and go, what is a sacrifice of thanksgiving? Because he says that. I'm in the fish and I'm praying with confidence because I know that you're a prayer-hearing God and you love me. So I am praying with confidence and I am offering you from the belly of the fish where I've been praying, a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Now, you could stop and say, what in the world is a sacrifice of thanksgiving? So let's break it down. First, what is a sacrifice?
Something that you give up.
Okay, it something that costs you something.
Right.
I mean, the temple sacrifices was you went out and bought a bull, you brought it, you sacrificed it to the Lord. You bought your first fruits. It cost you something to sacrifice it, right?
Yeah.
So thanksgiving would be, I'm going to give you thanks. What's the cost? What's the sacrifice of thanksgiving in a circumstance like this? Think about that. What does it cost you to give thanks to God when you're hurting? Whether you're hurting because you're being disobedient and God is spanking you, or you're hurting just because you're living through hard times, which happens sometimes, we offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. What's the cost? What does it cost us to thank God? An interesting question. What, Allie?
Really wrong, but I said it can cost us our pride.
Excellent. Okay. So we have to set aside our pride and say, God, you got me in a place. I need your help, right? So, and Thanksgiving is, a sacrifice of thanksgiving is, I got to set my pride aside and ask you for help. and give you thanks that you're going to help me because I can't help myself. All right? What else could it cost us besides pride?
It can cost our time.
All right? I want to be busy trying to fix my problem. But I'm going to offer a sacrifice of time and sit quietly and pray.
Right.
And offer that sacrifice where I think, man, in my panic, I should be doing something instead of just wasting my time praying, right?
Yeah.
So it costs me. I want to invest some time. I want to invest some pride in humbling myself. 1 Peter 5:6 says, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, in order that he will exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. So the casting our anxieties takes a humbling of waiting and praying and humbling ourselves before the mighty hand of God. Now, the other thing that it can cost us, and in my case, I've thought about this, where it costs me the willingness to give up control, to admit that I do not have control. Now, that might be humble. It's very similar to what you were saying, Allie. But to say I am at a point where I cannot do anything, so I'm going to humble myself and let you do it, and I'm going to give a sacrifice to. So that's an interesting thing for us to think about. Is how often in my life, in any circumstance, do I stop? And you can watch this tape again and get these notes from them off of my page. But I stopped and did a Bible study on what does it mean to give a sacrifice of thanksgiving, and how often do I stop and give God thanks when it costs me something? It's easy to give God thanks when it doesn't cost me anything, right?
Yeah.
But to give God thanks when it costs me something, I'm going to say, I got this is my last $20. I'm going to give you thanks by giving this to the church, or giving this to a friend who needs it. That's a sacrifice of thanksgiving.
True.
That's a challenge for us. And Jonah is there. And then the last verse of the chapter is the last verse. He says, but I with the voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you. That's future tense. I will do it. What I have vowed, I will pay. Now he says, now I made a vow when I became a prophet, and I realized that I sinned by disobeying. And so I will pay my vow of being a prophet. Okay. I'm going to pay it with my life, perhaps, and I'll go to heaven, but I'm going to pay my vows. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So he doesn't see the salvation yet. He is praying this prayer from the fish on the bottom. He is dead, perhaps. And he's praying, I know that I'm going to see God in heaven. I know he can answer my prayer. I'm going to give him the sacrifice of praise. And I know that he is a God who saves. Salvation belongs to the Lord, right? And then a very anticlimactic. In fact, read verse 10, Philip. It's very anticlimactic.
Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land.
Okay, we're going to talk about more of this next week, but he goes through this big thing in the fish, and then he prays, and so God says, okay, and you're out. It's like bang, and it just happens. There's no big rigmarole. There's no description of the gyrations the fish goes through, or it doesn't. It's a very matter of fact. He prays, so God does a miracle. The fish vomits him up, which is a pretty pukey thing to never mind. Sorry, couldn't resist. We're going to talk more about this next week. Think about now, next week, he's going to go into chapter 3. And chapter 3 is really the crux of the matter. We're going to get into racism. We're going to get into depression. We're going to get into all kinds of stuff. And we're going to get into see genuine repentance from people we would never expect to repent. We're going to see that in chapter 3 next week. I want you to think about this. What do you think when Jonah, he's puked up onto the shore, he walks into Nineveh, and there's quite a walk, and we saw that on a map 2 weeks ago. What does he look like? I want you to think about, what does Jonah look like after spending 3 days in the fish? Now, even if he's puked up, now he's puked up on the shore, and Nineveh is not like a mile away. It's a way inland, so it takes him a while to walk there. So even if he showers and shaves and does all this stuff, he takes a good sponge bath, whatever it is. Think about this next week. We're going to talk about this. What does Jonah look like when he walks into Nineveh with the message? And we're going to pick that up in chapter 3, verse 1. All right?
Okay.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Natalie, Allie, and Philip. I need to go alphabetical. So Allie, Philip, and never mind. It's way too much work. Anyway, thank you guys on YouTube for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit the like. That helps us with the algorithm. That lets YouTube know that you're actually watching. I appreciate this. I hope this has been an encouragement to you, to help you grow in a passion for studying God's Word. Use this video for your morning Bible study or devotional, or with a group. Watch it together and discuss it as a group. Whatever you want to do, it's yours to command. And we hope you share it with your friends. We hope you share it with your family. God bless you guys. We'll see you next week. Amen.
Yes.
Philip, you're going to be able to join us next week too?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. This is cool. Now I gotta coordinate a whole gang. Anyway, good night.